Good afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. We have a very special evening and program in store for you. I'm Andrew Campbell. I'm the arts manager for the city, and I am very pleased to present our Mayor of West Hollywood, John Duran.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here. Councilmember John D'Amico is present in the back with his husband, Keith Rand. And Councilmember Lauren Meister is also here with us. Okay, big breath. So, why do I say big breath? I have the opportunity to speak a lot. One of the difficult, this is always a difficult thing to go here, because in order to speak about the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, I have to be willing, and people who are going to be with us tonight have to be willing to go to that place. It's a place that I don't like to go to. It's a place that I don't like to remember about. It's a place that causes me a lot of discomfort and anxiety to go there. But I know that as a survivor of that period of time, that it's my moral responsibility to tell those stories, to remember the names, to talk about the heroism of the women and men who responded to the epidemic, and to keep their stories and their legacy alive. So whatever discomfort that I feel going there, it pales in comparison to the sacrifice that they made. So I'm willing to go there, and I have to tell you that it's an honor to be able to do this evening with Reverend Dr. Steve Peters and Phil Wilson and Karen Oakham. Each of them I've known a long time, since we were all young, 20-somethings, out there in the midst of all the chaos and the carnage. And to know that we are all still standing here as now longtime activists, people over 40, people that I never thought I would trust, people over 40, and to be able to share the stage with them tonight. And I'm meeting Rocco for the first time, so I'm glad you're here to moderate us. So that's all I want to say, because there's not much more to say at this point other than I'm glad we're having this evening. I want to acknowledge my former colleague, Mayor Abby Land, who's here with her husband, Martin Gatman, who certainly was an eyewitness to those early days. And I want to thank Mark Lehman and Jason and Craig and all the individuals who put together the group, the organization, to give us a center focal point, and that's the AIDS Monument. Craig and Dougherty and Connor and Mark Lehman, Jason and I, we sat at Café de Troyes, I guess it was about 8 or 9 years ago, and said, okay, it's time. We've caught our breaths. The dying has stopped for the most part. We're now at a place psychologically that we can start to tell the stories and gather the stories. And the way it's proceeding, it looks like we will have that monument open in 2020 or 2021, where we'll have a permanent place to gather and carry the stories forward. So that's all I want to say. Am I introducing Dan Tobin, or is somebody else doing that? I'm introducing, okay. Dan Tobin went through a very grueling selection process to be selected as the AIDS Monument Artist. He comes from the Down Under. And I'll introduce him next to come up and talk a bit about the monument and the project. And Dan, there you are. Please welcome artist Daniel Tobin.
Thanks, John, and thanks, everyone. A special thanks to the FAM board. I'm very excited to be back here again. It's been a little while since we have worked on the project. It's been put away for a little time. I'm just going to talk briefly about how I became involved in the monument. So you know, it felt like my two worlds were colliding when I saw the brief. It was a brief for artists, an open call for artists to respond to a monument to celebrate, but also recognise the AIDS impact of the AIDS epidemic on West Hollywood. 2 years before I looked at the brief, I myself had become HIV positive, and that was something I was still grappling with. But my work life, for 25 years, I'd been working with artists, architects, as an artist and designer myself, and exploring the public realm, how people interface with the public realm, how we can communicate and create an experience for people in the public realm. So the idea of the monument and my own connection to HIV/AIDS was just an amazing thing. And then to be selected to move forward with the project, it's been quite a journey. I came back here yesterday and was walking down the street with my partner Gilbert, and being here during Pride Month and seeing the activity on the street, seeing Rogerio and Mark Lehman today and others from FAM, you know, I feel very welcome in this community, and very excited by the next steps for the monument. So thank you.
Good evening. My name is Rocco KAYIATOS. I want to give I'm going to take up the least amount of time because I'm here to moderate an event, and the event being Building the Legacy, which is what we're all doing here in this moment and collectively as we think about this monument and what that's going to be. I think it's everyone's hope and concept that this is not a stagnant or statuesque kind of thing, but that it's a living monument, and in part that events like this are inspired to really breathe that life and become a community space and a place where people gather to remember, to reflect, to inspire, and to come be a community. Which I think also, like, briefly, I came to be a part of this through Wondros, the creative agency that has worked with FAM in the city of West Hollywood. And in my career as an artist and an activist, this was the single most important project that I've ever gotten to be a part of. And I say that because I think as a queer person, there isn't a lot of history that we have access to. And it's our responsibility to do that for ourselves and for each other. And as a younger queer activist, I think that it's always been deeply impactful and important for me to pay a debt of gratitude to generations that came before me, that struggled, that fought, that lost, and paved the way for me to live a life and be a person. And that's what this project felt like to be a part of for me. And it feels like a great honor to be in the room with people who are going to share their stories with us tonight. In part, this community, this is not just a storytelling or sharing moment, it's also in our hope in this event that you all take a moment to think about how you want to engage, and that this becomes more of a discussion after we hear from the three people that will be sharing their stories. First, I think we're going to preview. I'm fairly certain that most people in the room have not seen this piece of the website. So in part, though there will be a physical monument, there's also a digital component. This digital component is also going to be served to gather user-generated content. There's a timeline that's embedded. This is the first time this is being previewed? Yeah? Okay. And it's the hope of the city and of the Foundation of the AIDS Monument that people will be compelled to share their story and become a part of the legacy of protest, of history, of loss, and share their stories via photos, written pieces, videos, however you feel compelled to contribute, and that it will be an ongoing thing that people can contribute to. So the timeline has already been put in place, and there is a piece at the top. Do you want to show them? So at the top on the landing page, you can actually share your story. So it's as simple as entering your name, your email address, and then uploading an MP4, an MP3, a JPEG, whatever you want to include, and then uploading. And then from there, we'll show you a piece of the timeline and how it interacts.
I attended the National March on Washington, October the 11th, 1987. That was the birth moment for ACT UP all across the country. The story of ACT UP, at least here in Southern California, to me, it's the story of suburban kids becoming radicalized. We were young 20-year-olds, getting out of college, getting out of law school, ready to start life. And we had this plague in our midst, and it seemed to be unmanageable, and people all thought would respond. The government, religion, whatever, there was no response, and we had to become the first responders, and that's what produced ACT UP. So walking around West Hollywood sometimes, I see their faces, and I remember, and I know there'll come a time in 20 or 30 years where none of that's going to be remembered any longer with the pain. Because the generation just below me, they've understood maybe AIDS from reading it in the book, or maybe they know people who are HIV positive, but they didn't watch people waste away in front of their eyes. What they didn't see was the reaction of these men and women who responded with just such courage, like, I got your back, you got mine, we're gonna take on the world. And that I got to be an eyewitness to as well. And I think that's what continues to drive me now. If we can do that, we can do anything.
I think as Mayor Duran said, it's a certain level of graciousness and generosity and vulnerability that it takes to share these stories. Collectively as well as individually, and it's everyone's hope that this timeline serves to contextualize the history of the AIDS movement, of the protest, of the gathering, of the commitment to building and holding each other, that's so beautifully embedded in what happened and what continues to happen and how we come together and support each other. There's three people who've come to share their stories tonight, that being Reverend Dr. Steve Peters, Karen Oakham, and Phil Wilson. We're going to start the evening with Reverend Steve Peters. For those of you who don't know who he is, he served on the boards of directors for the AIDS Project LA, the AIDS Interfaith Council of Southern California, the AIDS National Interfaith Network, and the first Los Angeles City County AIDS Task Force. He was the field director for the AIDS Ministry of the Universal Fellowship of the Metropolitan Community Churches from 1987 through 97. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Steve Peters.
Thank you, Rocco. I really appreciate the introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share my story and hear the other stories that are going to be shared this afternoon. Now, if I could just enter the right passcode and get to my notes. Yeah, here we go. All right, well, I first became aware of something new and different and horrible happening when I was the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, Hartford, Connecticut, and I was a chaplain at Hartford Hospital. And one of my friends, a young, handsome man who had worked as a flight attendant, suddenly got terribly ill. This was 1981, and I came upon him as I was making my rounds as a chaplain at Hartford Hospital. His name was Bill, and he told me that he'd had this very strange pneumonia, and they didn't know what it was, but they thought he had tertiary syphilis. And I thought that was really weird. He thought it was really weird. And we talked about what that meant to him, and he was afraid already of dying. And indeed, he did die, not much later. And never was diagnosed with anything related to AIDS. It was tertiary syphilis. Well, then I started getting sick. And I first noticed the symptoms of what came to be known as AIDS when I developed a white coating on my tongue, a really cracked coating that went down my throat. And that was candidiasis, and of course, and the doctor in Hartford said, "Oh, that's just some sign, that just means you've got some sort of virus on board." Yeah, only we didn't know what kind of virus then because it hadn't been discovered. I moved out to Los Angeles because I knew that I wasn't going to get the kind of medical care that I needed as I started reading about AIDS, or what was then called GRID. I was diagnosed first in 1982 with gay-related immunodeficiency, or GRID. I got horribly sick as soon as I moved out here in '82. And over the next 2 years, I had hepatitis, cytomegalovirus, pneumonia, mononucleosis, herpes, shingles, a variety of fungal infections, candidiasis. My immune system was breaking down, and I was picking up everything. And they told me then I had ARC, AIDS-related complex, because it was difficult to get an AIDS diagnosis. There were only 5 conditions that qualified you for an AIDS diagnosis. All the men in my life disappeared, and it was the women who took care of me over in my little house in Mount Washington. And it was this group of lesbians who really took care of me during those 2 years when I was housebound by my illness. And I will never forget them, and I will never forget to thank them for what they did when the men were too scared. I was a walking symbol of everything they were most afraid of. It took me 3 months to find a deacon in MCC who would bring me communion in my house. As far as MCC was concerned, AIDS hadn't happened yet, and they were in denial about it. And I remember Troy Perry telling people, "Oh, well, he's too vanilla to have AIDS." I was very, very sick, and my immune system was breaking down, and I had ARC, and nobody believed me, except this group of women who stayed by me. Then in April of '84, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma, Kaposi sarcoma, and full-blown AIDS, and I was given 8 months to live. I was told I wouldn't live to see 1985. And I remember being treated with a lot of, I was served on paper plates a lot, I was invited into people's homes, but I was asked not to use their bathroom. I immediately decided to be a public person with AIDS. There weren't very many of us back in '84. And I remember TV studios who wanted to interview me would not let me into the TV studio. they interviewed me from an alley outside AIDS Project Los Angeles. And when I went to give them back the earphone that they gave me to hear the host in the studio, I gave it back to the sound guy, and he said, "Oh, no, you throw that away. You throw that away." And my friend Bob here, who was the director of the AIDS hotline at APLA, he says he had a whole drawer full of earphones. He's straight. He didn't have AIDS, and they still were terrified of taking the earphone back from him. They were scared of coming in to APLA, period. Well, I managed to live into 1985, and obviously, and I was, because I defied the odds, my doctor, Alexandra Levine, at USC LA County Hospital, is one of the primary AIDS researchers in this country, in the world, really. She invited me to be the very first patient to go on the very first antiviral drug they ever tried against HIV, a drug called Suramin. It was one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make, and I prayed a lot about it, and I talked to a lot of people about it, and a lot of people who sort of didn't know me all that well said, "No, don't do it, don't do it. They're trying to kill us, you know, and they're trying to kill you with this experimental drug." And a lot of the people who knew me really well said, "You've always been a kind of living on the edge kind of guy, Steve. Go for it. Besides, if this is it, you want to be there for it." So I did. I decided to go on the drug. It was an experimental chemotherapy. I received the drug 1 gram a week for 36 weeks. And within 6 weeks, all of my KS lesions disappeared, and my lymphoma went into complete remission, and the HIV virus was successfully suppressed in my system. Well, I wanted to shout it from the rooftop, and I wanted to let everybody know, and my doctor said, Dr. Levine said, "No, you mustn't tell anybody until we can replicate these results." And she was right to do that, because the drug proved to be extremely toxic. A large percentage of the people who took Suramin were killed by the drug, and everybody else, with the exception of one other guy, died from the progression of HIV and AIDS within the next year or two. I am one of only 2 survivors of the Suramin trials, which are now, I don't know, kind of notorious. So it very nearly killed me, and it blew out my adrenal glands. It caused me to go blind. I was paralyzed on the left side of my body. I had major neuromuscular damage, lost all the hair. I wasted away to nothing. I mean, I looked like I was about to die, and indeed everybody thought I was. Then I started getting well in April of '86. And I started getting better and better and better and better and better until I was really well again. And I wanted to start working out, because I'd been into the gym before getting so sick, and I wanted to get back to the gym. And the neurologist who was seeing me said, "Oh, no, you must never work out again. You'll break the muscles down further and they'll never develop again." You know, well, Dr. Levine said, "Go for it. You know, if you believe that it's going to help, do it." And I went back and I found the tiniest little dumbbell I could find and made my left arm work using my right arm, because my left arm didn't want to work by itself. And gradually I began to get the use back on both sides of my body, and I built my body back up again. And I remember seeing that neurologist at 5P21 at County Hospital not long after I really built my body back up again. I said, "Hi, Doc, remember me?" And he turned and walked the other way. I made him wrong, you know, sorry. So I got well, and I was made the director of AIDS ministry for the metropolitan community churches worldwide. And over the next 12 years, I traveled all over the world, teaching and preaching about AIDS, trying to bring hope in the face of all the hopelessness. I believe that it was and is important to maintain hope, even when you are facing death. Hope changes when you're facing death, as I discovered when I went to work as a volunteer chaplain at the Chris Brownlee AIDS Hospice. And I'd like to tell you a few stories from that. period. This was the late 80s, early 90s. I was there for about 5 years. And 3 people in particular, well, more than 3, but I'll tell you about these 3. One of the first people I met there was Maria, and she was a young Filipino-American woman whose husband and children had dropped her at the Chris Brownlee AIDS Hospice because she had AIDS and said goodbye. She was abandoned by them, and she never saw them again. And when I first met her, it was her first or second day at the hospice, and she was grieving mightily that she was never going to see her little children again. And you know, very likely, I don't know this, but it's very likely that her husband was bisexual and gave her the disease. But he abandoned her at the hospice for us to take care of, right? She died very shortly thereafter. She had no hope. There was nothing to live for, and she died. And then there was Johnny. Johnny was a beautiful young African-American man who got very thin very quickly and was in the hospice with full support of his family, and they were all there, and I would go and I would talk to him about what it meant to have hope in face of death. He said, I said, you know, it's going to be okay. And he said, no, it's not. I'm dying. And I said, that's what I mean. You're going to be out of pain. Your suffering is going to be over. And I believe that you will be in heaven. And he really thought he was going to hell. But I worked on trying to persuade him he was going to heaven. And you know something? He came to his death with a very graceful, lovely attitude and a graceful experience of dying, which was extraordinary to watch. Well, his memorial service was held at the Chris Brownlee Hospice, and I went to it, and I'm glad I did because the family pastor who was to do the service was a no-show. So I did the service. And it was my honor and privilege to share with his family and to help them to grieve. And then there was Connie Norman. Many of you remember her. She was at the AIDS hospice, and boy, was she pissed. She was just pissed, you know. And she was so frustrated because she had been writing this wonderful column in, I don't remember what newspaper it was, but it was one of the LGBT, Update, San Diego Update. And she'd been writing this wonderful column, and she was so angry because she couldn't write it anymore, and she had so much to say. So I brought my little Tandy laptop with me to the hospice, and she dictated to me her final columns. And she wrote some really wonderful columns in those last days. And then it came time for me to go to the International AIDS Conference in Vancouver. And she said, I told her that I wasn't going to be there for the next week or so because I was going to the Vancouver AIDS Conference, the International AIDS Conference. And she said, you do me a favor. Have them open the door of the airplane and piss all over that conference. Well, I didn't do that, but it was at that conference where they announced the success of the protease inhibitor trials and that they were going to start spreading the news and spreading the good medicine and helping people live with this. And I came back and I told Connie that, and she was still pissed because she knew it was too late for her. And indeed, she died not all that much later. And she died pissed. And it was a really healthy pissed. It really was. So, you know, this story about Johnny's pastor, well, you know, there were a lot of churches that abandoned us. And there were a lot of churches that did violence to us. Gay people, lesbian people, transgender people, and people with AIDS, certainly. But there were a number of faith communities, from MCC to BCC, Beth Chaim Hadashim, to All Saints Episcopal in Pasadena, All Saints Episcopal in Beverly Hills, First Congregational Church of LA, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, that were really there for us. They were there, and they were in the fight, in the midst of it all. And I really think it's important to remember that. Not every church abandoned its people with AIDS or caused violence against the gay and lesbian community, the transgender community, and the AIDS community. I remember a time when I was first sick, and a doctor told me, you know, you in the spiritual world have more to offer than we do in the medical world. And we did for a long time. And we were present to people. And I hope that this AIDS monument, whatever form it ends up taking, whatever stories it ends up telling, I hope that it reflects the anger and the rage that Connie Norman represented. I hope it remembers the terror and the despair and the horror of living with this horrible disease amongst us and watching our friends, our loved ones die. I hope that the monument reflects our grief, the extraordinary amount of bereavement, the multiple layers of grief that we all experienced who lived through that period. And I hope that the monument will reflect the importance of hope, the importance of faith, the importance of believing in something greater than yourself. You know, I remember when I was growing up, my favorite childhood story was Peter Pan. And of course, in Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, the little fairy, is dying. And Peter turns to the audience and says, Tinkerbell is dying because people don't believe in fairies. If you believe in fairies, clap your hands and bring Tinkerbell back to life. And of course, for decades, 100 years now, people all over the world have gone, yes, I believe in fairies. Well, there were a lot of us good fairies who were dying in the 80s and 90s, and we needed people to believe in us. And there were people who believed in us, like my fellow panelists, the mayor here, so Allison and Bob, so many of you. And I think that it's really important that we learn to believe in ourselves. You know, that brought us life, even in the face of death. You know, living so close to death for so many years, I have come only to cherish life more and more. The preciousness of life, the fragility of life. It is amazing to have this gift of life. I'm so grateful every day that I am a survivor, and I mourn every day the people that died, Bill and Connie and Johnny and Maria, so many others, countless others. And I thank God that finally there's going to be an AIDS monument. Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please welcome our next storyteller, Karen Oakham. She is an award-winning LGBT journalist who started her career at CBS News in New York in 1973, ended as the producer of CBS News affiliate coverage for the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Karen took a brief break from journalism to work on the West Hollywood cityhood movement, serving as the first GPAC in 1985 with a focus on substance abuse and AIDS services. She returned to journalism, this time for the LGBT press in the 1980s after more than 100 friends died from AIDS. Karen still works as a journalist, and I would like you to all put your hands together and welcome her to the stage.
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm going to go there. So this is hard for me. I'm putting the notebook down. I'm opening up. I'm going to tell you the truth about my experience. You know, as a journalist, it's my job to stay out of the story. It's my job to tell the stories of other people. But I've been asked to tell my story, and so that's what I'm going to do. But, you know, please bear with me. I actually had to write it down because I, you know, don't trust myself. So please bear with me. I don't have HIV, but I am an AIDS survivor. I'm one of millions whose whole life changed because of AIDS. Someone with PTSD and survivor's guilt. Given my reckless behavior during the 1970s, why am I still alive when so many others are gone? I made a promise to each one as they were slipping away. I promised to remember them, and now, 34 years later, many of their names and faces are fading. But I remember the time. It is seared into my soul. And I will never forget how such terrible agony forged an incredible existential movement that saved so many lives, if not their own. And I will never forget how, for what seemed like an eternity in the 80s and 90s, this disparate collection of despised individuals came together across race, class, and gender to create a spiritual vanguard that reflected the very best of humanity. I know this because it was my job to witness and record it. But before that, it was my job, my honor, and my responsibility to be the very best friend I could to friends who were dying, many, too many, dying alone, rejected by their families. I became a journalist for the gay press because I lost so many friends. About 150 when I stopped counting in 1990. I felt being a journalist was a way I could be of service, telling the stories of the unknown and the famous, equal in their desperate struggle to stay alive. But other than shares at 12-step meetings or the occasional op-ed, I kept my personal story behind the byline until now. This story starts in 1980. I was a broadcast associate at CBS News in New York, and my bosses got me clean and sober through the Employee Assistance Program. I was 30, and I was a mess. One night, I took the bus to a meeting on 9th Avenue behind a red door. Someone pulled me aside and said, "This is a men's stag," but they could see I was desperate, and they let me stay. In fact, gay men took care of me, wanting nothing in return, which was not my usual experience in those days. By 1983, I wanted to do something else before I got locked into the inevitable career trajectory laid out before me. I wanted to go to LA. My girlfriend pulled out a map, put it on the bed, and said, "Okay, close your eyes and pick a place." I closed my eyes and circled around and around, dropped my finger on the map. She laughed and said, "No, try again." I'd landed on Forest Lawn. She moved the map around, I tried again, and again, Forest Lawn. What the hell? My girlfriend was getting a little freaked out. Again, close the eyes, circle, 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 Forest Lawn. The universe was trying to tell me something. We wound up on the Sunset Strip, driving around checking for rent signs. We finally found an apartment on Laurel Avenue in unincorporated West Hollywood. I did one more gig for CBS News. I produced the Olympics for CBS affiliates out of TV City. And then my world changed. I volunteered with the West Hollywood Cityhood movement, and because I wanted to be a playwright, I started taking acting classes with Salome Jens to see what actors would do with my words. It was 1984, and gay men were coming down with this mysterious illness and disappearing. None of us knew what to do. We were terrified. Gay men were pouring into 12-step rooms searching for help, comfort, a cure. Fairly quickly, families were formed, old grudges were forgiven, and judging someone by old standards of beauty became morally incomprehensible. Hell, lesbians joked that we had seen more penises, balls, and butts cleaning up our friends than in all the years we pretended to be straight. Bill Lavallee took a handful of us to hospital bedsides where anonymous gay men lay dying alone in the darkness. We brought a touch of humanity, briefly uplifting the burden of grief. We were doing spiritual triage on a battlefield with no reinforcements in sight. An odd camaraderie develops during a death watch. One night, Bill Lavallee and some other folks and I were sitting around the bed waiting for Don Fusco, a young jazz singer, to die. He was in a coma, and we would stroke his head and squeeze his hand as we told each other stories. Then we'd fall silent. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't stay any longer. I kissed Donnie's forehead and told him I'd always remember him. As I let go of his hand and started to leave, he suddenly shot straight up in the bed. We all gasped. I jumped back and hurried back to my chair. Okay, I'll stay. The ache was so great. Churning beneath our gentle assurances was a fury at helplessly watching this amazing talent being snuffed out too soon. Bill said Donnie died shortly after I left. My first AIDS death was Stephen Pender in 1986. A year earlier, I was having a tough time, and I raised my hand at a meeting at Fairfax and Fountain and confessed that at 5 years clean and sober, I was feeling suicidal. This guy raised his hand, said he was 9, but at 5 he felt suicidal too. After the meeting, I thanked him and was shocked when he said he remembered me from that red door, behind that red door on 9th Avenue. For the next year, we did whatever we could to keep Stephen alive. There was the God Squad, who came to clean his house every day. My HIV-positive sponsee, Steve, a health nut, cooked him macrobiotic meals. We all wore masks and gloves when he had his Hickman catheter put in, lest any germ cause an infection. We'd sit on the couch and talk, a distraction from seeing the wrinkles on his jeans getting bigger and bigger as he got skinnier and skinnier. Stephen was a singer, actor, and writer, and very popular with the Hollywood gay boys. But at some point, they stopped coming around. I was furious. They were abandoning him. Then someone said it was because in looking at Stephen, they were looking in the mirror at what was going to happen to them. They needed that last shred of denial. I stopped judging after that. Stephen's family flew in from Boston and took over his house, kicking out his roommate and claiming all his stuff. He was 35 and in denial. He couldn't grasp that he needed a will, and now the law was on their side. Stephen was in Cedars-Sinai, too weak to fight after a horrendous bout of throwing up and diarrhea. I don't know if his family came to visit. They were Boston Catholics, and while they were proud of his guest spots on TV shows like Hill Street Blues, they were ashamed that he was gay and had AIDS. I was living off savings and spot jobs, so I had free time for hospital visits. Stephen was in the Betty Ford wing, the rich alcoholic ward, quietly housing people with AIDS. For some reason, he had his own room. But hanging with Stephen wasn't easy. He was angry. He was angry at being abandoned. He was angry at not being able to finish a play he was writing. He was really, really pissed that he was losing his voice. He'd tried to sing and he could only get out a raspy few lines past the thrush in his throat and swollen tongue. He was furious and deeply humiliated that as a once proud, fastidious gay man, he had lost control over all his bodily functions. He didn't care that nobody cared. Stephen just fumed over dying for no reason. Sometimes he took his anger out on me for the simplest of things. He'd be thirsty and ask for water, and as I maneuvered the straw in the cup, he'd yell in his raspy voice, "Let me do it." His hands were trembling, and I knew he'd spill it and then get mad at the spill. But I also knew he needed a sense of self-control, of dignity. It was important. On March 1st, 1986, the day Stephen died, I went to Cedars, but he wasn't in his room. The nurse said he had a really bad night with projectile vomiting, and they moved him to ICU. When I got there, the nurse said he was in a coma, and barring a miracle, would probably die within hours. Word quickly spread that folks should dash to Cedars to say their goodbyes. For 2 seconds, I struggled with whether I should stay or go. There was no clue as to how long Stephen would hang on. And then I thought of how Stephen had saved me twice. The first time behind the red door, the second at Fairfax and Fountain. I stayed. I owed him. I had a quick shiver remembering how I waved goodbye to my friends on the airport tarmac as they headed off to Vietnam. I sensed that Stephen was just the first of many long AIDS goodbyes. I sat with him throughout the day as friends came and went, all of us assuming Stephen could hear us in his coma. One group brought a cassette tape recorder and played some of Stephen's favorite music. Some of the old Hollywood cute guys came too, looking gaunt and frail. I left the room to give them privacy. In the in-between time, I read to Stephen, or talked to him, or just sat quietly, my hand on his clammy arm, or cooling his brow. At one point, I had a moment of panic. I bit my nails too deeply and had a slight open wound. What if some of Stephen's sweat got in there? Could I catch HIV? I got up and washed my hands and looked at my dying friend. He was worth the risk. I got a Band-Aid and resumed my post. Late in the night, a small group of black singers came in. They held hands and prayed and quietly sang over him. I forgot how they said they knew him. It didn't matter. We all felt that he was cradled by the music. Around midnight, Stephen's secret lover came in, and the whole atmosphere, the very air in the room changed. It was filled with the spirit of love, a hue of light gold. Something was happening, as if Stephen knew Michael was there. I left them alone. Stephen's secret lover apparently had not been cool enough for his other friends. Paul Manette would later say that love in the age of AIDS was like dancing in a minefield. Until now, these two had been dancing in the dark. When Michael came out of Stephen's room, he was choked up but at peace. He thanked me for staying, then handed me a paperback copy of As Is. Stephen had given me the play, signed by his friend Bill Hoffman, but I'd left it at Stephen's house, superstitiously fearing that if I took it home, I might hasten his death. We had lots of superstitions and magical thinking in those days. When I went back into his room, only a hint of the golden glow remained. Stephen had waited for Michael, and now it was time to go. Suddenly, Stephen's breathing changed dramatically. I rushed to get the nurse. "Something's happening, come quickly." The nurse rushed back with me, took his vitals, and cupped his head. "Do something," I said, panicking. "Isn't this what you want? He's dying. If I do something, it will only prolong the inevitable." I stepped back, overwhelmed. As someone who's struggled against suicide since I was a teenager, in the face of death, I had just experienced this full-on flash of choosing life. I calmed down and returned to Stephen's side, stroking his forearm. Stroking his forearm as his death rattle nudged aside the silence. I told him it was okay to go. I told him that the warm golden light awaited him on the other side. I told him that his friends were waiting there too. I told him he was not alone. That night, I was afraid to go to sleep. I kept replaying Stephen's death over and over until suddenly I realized that his death was like the third step. Stephen made a decision to turn his will and his life over to the care of God as he understood God. He surrendered. I felt more at peace. I closed my eyes and started to doze off, and then Stephen's spirit visited me. He was in his hospital bed, and he sat up, and he gave me a big thank you hug. Stephen's friends produced a memorial for him at Fairfax and Fountain, after which they planted a small ficus tree outside the church's side door on Fountain Avenue. It's still there, a mighty tree now, watered and fed by years of 12-step coffee grinds and laughter wafting up from intimate conversations. I think of Stephen every time I pass by. I see a parade of others too. The flash of a face tells a whole story, a story like this one. I'm sure you have your flashes and stories too. The AIDS crisis was our Holocaust. It is our duty and our honor to never forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. Phil Wilson is our last storyteller this evening. He's the president and CEO of the Black AIDS Institute, the only national HIV/AIDS think tank focused exclusively on Black people. In addition, he served on the AIDS as the AIDS coordinator for the city of LA, the director of policy and planning of LA's of AIDS Project Los Angeles, co-chaired the LA County HIV Health Commission, appointee to the HRSA AIDS Advisory Committee, and has served on the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. Please, and we're lucky enough to hear a piece of his story this evening. Please welcome Phil Wilson.
Thank you very much, Rocco, for that introduction. I am normally not nervous about following other speakers, but there's something that is terribly unjust about having to follow Karen and Steve Peters this evening. I have to get better at reading the notes that my assistant prepared for me when I do these things. I read the part about panel. I didn't read the part about speaking, so I wasn't, I'm not quite prepared. But there are some thoughts that come to mind when I think about the stories that are important to be told. I graduated from college in 1978. And in 1980, much to everyone who I knew, quite frankly, including me, I discovered that I was gay. And at the time, I was engaged to be married to my college sweetheart. We had spent the entire time in college together, and we had moved to Chicago together, and our wedding was months away. And as the wedding got closer and closer and closer, I got more and more anxious. And I didn't completely understand why I was getting anxious, since we had been together for 6 years and we had planned this thing, and all of a sudden I was kind of getting cold feet. And one day, I was on my way to work, and there was an interview on the radio by the then publisher of Blue Boy magazine. I don't know if any of you remember that magazine. And a light bulb went off in my head, literally that's the problem. And I went to a bookstore and looked for gay books, of which there was this tiny, tiny section. And there were 3 books in the section: Loving Someone Gay, Dancer from the Dance, and Frontrunner. And I bought those 3 books, and I took them home to my fiance, and I said, we probably need to read these books. And so we sat down in our living room and began to read these books. And that was a Wednesday. And on Saturday, I called my mother, and I said, we need to have a talk. And I went to see my mother, and I took her Loving Someone Gay. And I took my mom the book, and she looked at the book, and she says, why are you giving me this book? I don't love someone gay. And I said, I think you do, because I think that you love me. And she kind of began to talk about things that mothers sometimes talk about, you know, did I do this, did I do that, did I do the other thing? And I basically said, wait a minute, no, this is my story. No, we'll get to your story later, if need be. But this is not about you. And she says, well, maybe you are having cold feet because of the wedding. And I said, well, yeah, I am having cold feet about the wedding, but not because of the wedding. And she said, well, are you happy? And I said, I think so. I'm not sure. And she says, well, if you're happy, I'm happy. I just have one thing. Don't tell your father. And so on Sunday, I called my dad, and I said, we need to talk. And I took him, you know, the front runner. And he said, what is this about? And I said, it's about this gay kid and coming out and what have you. And he said, are you gay? And I said, I think so. And he said, am I the last one to know? And I said, no, you're not the last one to know. I told Mom, and she told me not to tell you, so I'm telling you anyway. And he said, no, are you happy? And I said, I think so. And he says, well, if you're happy, I'm happy. And so I went back to Blue Boy magazine, and I've been a high school athlete and a college athlete. And in Blue Boy magazine, there were advertising around for gay bathhouses, although they didn't call them gay bathhouses then, they called them gay health clubs. And I thought, well, that's a perfect place to meet people, you know. And so I called up Club Baths in Chicago, and I said, well, I'm interested in coming to your club, and are the people nice? And the queen on the other side of the phone said, girlfriend, that's all about you. And so I got my gym things, and I went downtown Chicago, and I went to Club Baths, and so and sure enough, you know, there's a steam room, and there are weights, and there's all these things on the first floor. And so I'm exercising, and people were coming up, and they were saying, do you want to go upstairs? And I'm like, no, why would I want to go upstairs? You know? And so 2 or 3 people asked me, did I want to go upstairs? And each time I said no. And so I finished working out, and I sat down in the area where they had a big screen where there's pornography playing. I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. And I had never seen in fact, I had never seen pornography of any sort, male or otherwise. And this guy came down with this full head of curly hair, and black fishnet underwear. He was about 5'11" and probably weighed 120 pounds. And his name was Chris Brownlee. You've heard that name earlier this evening. And he sat down with me, and he says, well, what are you doing? And I explained to him, and I said, so why is everyone asking me to go up to their rooms? And he says, well, this is a place where people come to have sex. And I was like, oh. And so he says, you want to go up to go up to a room with me. And so I said, okay. And at this point, Chris's story and my story diverged, even though we were having the same experience. I will share with you his story, and then I will share with you my story. His story is that we went upstairs and got a room, and we eventually had sex. My story is, and part of the story, there is some commonality in the story. My story is we went up to the room and he talked about having sex. And I said, well, how do two men do that? And he explained to me how two men have anal sex. And I said, that's not possible. I don't believe that. No, there's got to be an alternative way, because that's just not possible. My story is that we talked and I went home, or I left, and at the end, as I was leaving, I asked him I asked him if he wanted my telephone number. And he said, no, I'll give you my telephone number. And if you want to see me again, you can call me. Later on, we determined that the reason why we have different memories, and I'm sure his memory was correct, is because I could not imagine that my first sexual encounter was going to be in a bathhouse. And so my emotional mind would not allow that to be the case. In the end, Chris and I were together for 10 years until the day that he died in 1989. And I like to share a few things about that. He and I joined a gay athletic association in Chicago. We did gay bowling and gay volleyball and gay baseball. And one day, a member of our baseball team didn't show up for practice. His name was Alejandro. And we didn't know anything what was going on. But he didn't show up for practice, and a month later, he was dead. Chris went to the doctor one day, and because he hadn't been feeling well, and he came home and he said, I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, the doctor said I had these swollen lymph nodes, and there's this thing going around among gay men that involves swollen lymph nodes. And I said, well, I have swollen lymph nodes as well. And so I went and we had our lymph nodes biopsied, and the doctor said, well, you both have these lymph nodes and they're a little odd, but he didn't know anything about the swollen lymph nodes. He just knew that he had read something about swollen lymph nodes. And shortly after that, Dr. Michael Gottlieb published his paper about the 5 men that he had identified at UCLA. And we thought, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe that's what's going on with us. Shortly after that, we moved to Los Angeles. And by the time we got to Los Angeles, there was some activity going on. The Carposi-Sarcoma Foundation existed in San Francisco. I remember a meeting at the Department of Water and Power where they came down to try to create a similar organization here in Los Angeles, and they wanted the center to be the place where that happened. And the executive director and the board members at the center was like, no way are we going to do that. And a number of us were like, well, we have to do something. And out of that meeting, one of the things that we did was to create the first candlelight vigil in Westwood at what was then the Ronald, well, I guess it still is the Ronald Reagan building in Westwood. And it was kind of interesting to me, having been from Chicago, and we're having these conversations when by that time it was very clear what was going on. And the biggest debate was whether or not we were going to walk on the sidewalks or the streets. And I thought, we're going to walk on the streets. And if they arrest us, they'll arrest us. but we're going to walk on the streets. We're going to take over the streets. And so we did. We walked and we walked in the streets, and we had the rally in Westwood, and it really kind of said a lot about nobody was going to save us but us. That if we didn't step up, no one was going to do anything about us. And what is true about the history of the AIDS epidemic and what is true about HIV and AIDS today, and let us be clear, while we're talking about a memorial, we're talking about a memorial on something that is not yet over, and we can never forget that. That HIV and AIDS is still a challenge in our communities. That some medications that work for some folks some of the time does not a cure make. But I want to share with you if we move ahead to 1989 and the experience associated with the end of Chris's life. At some point, we really realized that we were in the final days. And we had this conversation, and we had opened the Chris Brownlee Hospice, and we decided, always with politics in our mind, because that's who we were, that if Chris was going to die, he had to die in the Chris Brownlee Hospice. That it would be inappropriate for him to die anywhere else. And so as the final days approached, we took him to the Chris Brownlee Hospice. And in the middle of the night, one night, the following happened. The jarring sound of the phone ringing startled me. I wasn't asleep, but because I hadn't slept in days, I wasn't quite awake either. "Is this the Chris Brownlee Hospice?" asked an unfamiliar voice on the other end of the phone. Yeah, I guess so, I stuttered. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and all I could wonder was who would be asking such a question at this hour in such an insistent tone. "Who is this?" I said. "May I help you?" "Can you confirm what time Chris Brownlee died?" the voice demanded rather than ask. You've got to be kidding me, I thought. The whole thing had seemed like a dream. I guess this call meant the nightmare had taken an unexpected, unappreciated turn for the worse. "I beg your pardon, who is this?" "I'm sorry, this is the LA Times. I'm on deadline. I already have the obituary. I just need to confirm the time of death." "Listen, I'm Chris Brownlee's lover. I don't know who the fuck you are, but he's not dead yet. Thank you very much. I'll tell you what, when he does die, I'll make sure someone calls you." "Oh, I'm really sorry." This time, he was the one who stuttered. "I didn't mean, I know. I'm sorry too," I said. "You really need to find a better way to do this." I hung up the phone and I quietly went back to my vigil. I had answered crisply, but inside of me rose a sick sort of panic. Not only was I going to have to go through Chris's actual death, but even this would not be the end of it for me. People were going to be asking me questions that I would have to answer again and again, and I would be forced to relive this nightmare forever. Even when it was over, it wouldn't be over. I went back to his room. I sat there and I watched him. I don't think I cried that night. I just sat there in that chair next to Chris's bed. I just sat there in that chair and started to remember. I don't remember all the places my mind took me that night, but I gladly went. I knew what was going to happen, and trucking off and into our nostalgic past was better than staring unflinchingly into what seemed to me to be my desolate future. It's feeling cheated because it was supposed to be forever, and it was only 10 years. I wrote this poem 2 days after Chris died. It is the breaking of your heart every time you have to leave him in the hospital. It's to have to leaving him in the hospital too often. It's being a member of the team that makes the decisions about his care. It's making the final decisions all by yourself. It's the echo in his voice in your ear on the eve of his death when he says to you, "Take me home." It's the echo of your voice in the hollow of your heart created by the pain of the loss. It's saying, "I'm fine, I'll take care of everything, I'll handle it." It's discovering that you're not fine. You can't take care of anything, and this time you can't handle it. It's feeling the pain of knowing each bit of hurt is a celebration of the love you feel for each other. It's the chuckle in his voice when he awakes from the coma in the middle of the night to tell you he loves you. It's telling him that you love him as he takes his last breath. It's holding him and feeling the warmness of his life leave his body. It's driving down the freeway and being blinded by your tears. It's not knowing that you are crying. It's wondering what will happen to you when your time comes and he's not there to send you home. It's knowing he will be there. It's the numbness, the panic, the fear, the sadness. It's the blindness. It's the rage over what's happening to you and to him. It's remembering in the middle of the day and feeling as if it were happening all over again. It's the loneliness because you have no other friend like him. It's calling your landlord to find out how much the rent or calling the bank to find out what your balance is because he did those things. It's sitting at home and wondering what's keeping him because you forgot he's not coming home. It's keeping the tape on the answering machine because it's a way of hearing his voice. It's being glad to return home after a trip because you know the cats miss him nearly as much as you do. It's keeping his driver's license, wearing both your wedding bands, isolating yourself from family and friends because you don't know what else to do. Chris woke up about 3 days after that telephone call and said, "Take me home." And I said, "Okay." And I called all the friends and I said, "We're going home." And they said, "Well, how are you going to take care of him?" I said, "I've taken care of him for this long. We will be okay." They said, "But it'll be hard to take care of him." But I knew that when he said, "Take me home," he meant it in two ways. He meant that he wanted to die in our home. And I knew that it wouldn't take long. So we got the bed, we got weeks of diapers, we got the IV tubes and the IV stands and all of these things so that we could take care of him at home. We got him home at 6 o'clock that evening. At 10 o'clock, I said to him, "We're home. It's okay. I'm going to be all right." And he turned his head and he stopped breathing. And first, I just rubbed his feet until they turned cold. And then I turned to his ankles until there was a chill, and up to his knees, and finally to his chest. And I said goodbye. I want to end with one other story, because I think that it is important, if we're going to do an AIDS memorial, that memorial is not a historical institution. In, I think, 1992, John, you may remember, there was an event in Washington, D.C. called the War Conference, because they're making war against us. And it was in Virginia. And I remember getting off the plane in Dulles and driving hours to literally a plantation in Virginia. This plantation that they had turned into a conference center was literally the plantation where the Confederate Army staged their attack on Washington, D.C. And someone had the great idea to turn this to a conference center, and not only turn it to a conference center, but to rehab all of the original buildings and give them the original names and purposes that they had when they were a slave plantation. And so we arrived late at night, and we're in check-in, and I get there to check in, I give them my name, and they said, "Oh, you're staying in the stable." And I go, "Excuse me?" So they had turned the stable into sleeping rooms. So then the first meeting was in the big house, which was the slave master's home. And so we start this meeting, and as would happen in those days, when LGBT folks came together, we would talk about what do you like about the community, and also that what happened in these days, all these caucuses would happen. This was at a point in time when our goal was to splinter ourselves in such small caucuses that, so there, first of all, there had to be a men's and a women's caucus. Then there had to be a caucus for people who didn't like perfumes. And then there had to be, like a leather caucus or whatever. But there are all these caucuses, And so the first exercise was, what do you like about the LGBT community? And so I looked around the room, and there were 5 people of color in this gathering of 200 folks. Not 5 black people, 5 people of color, in this room. And so person after person stands up and they say, well, what I like about our community is the diversity. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, are they in the same room that I'm in? And I'm staying in the stable? And so it gets to me, and I said, well, I want there to be a caucus. And I think there should be a people of color caucus. And I recommend that we meet in the telephone booth in the lobby. Now, I look at some of you don't know what telephone booths are, but there's these little tiny, tiny glass boxes that people used to actually make telephone calls out of that could only hold 1 person. And so people were like upset, and people would come up to me and say, well, you can't, we're here for a purpose, and you can't be divisive. And I was like, okay, you explain to me how I'm supposed to resolve this. Now, is it that today I can be black and tomorrow I'm going to be gay? You explain to me how this works. But at the event, there was a young man named Ken Dawson. And Ken Dawson and I hit it off. And so we began to talk about each other. He was the one person that came up to thank me, other than the other 4 people of color who came up to thank me for what I said, for raising this issue. And so I asked him, well, what do you do? And he said that I work for an organization called SAGE. Now, SAGE is an organization for older LGBT folks. Mind you, this is 1992, okay? And he says, we're trying to create a safe space, for older LGBT folks. And I said, good luck with that. I said, now you do know that there's an AIDS epidemic going on. And there's a good chance that there's not going to be very many of us that are going to be around, to need elder services. And you really should get a day job. And so Ken looked at me and he said, well, I'm counting on you to take care of that. And I think about that a lot. Ken saying, I'm counting on you to take care of that. Because, I have been recently diagnosed with AIDS myself. And my doctor said, you should go home and put your affairs in order, and you have probably 6 months to live. And I thought, I'm not 30 years old yet. I don't have any affairs to put in order. On my last birthday, I celebrated 62 times around the sun. Clearly, that doctor was wrong. Last month, I was honored by SAGE with their Lifetime Achievement Award. So, while we haven't taken care of it yet, and this is where I will close, at the Black AIDS Institute, we still get calls. We get calls every day. We get early morning calls, midday calls, late afternoon calls. We get calls from folks who just found out they're HIV positive, and either they didn't know how to protect themselves or they didn't think their lives were worth protecting. We get calls from mothers who are still reeling from the grief and the guilt of having lost a child to AIDS that they rejected. We do HIV testing, and we have an HIV positivity rate of 8% here in Los Angeles. 8%. There's almost no place else on the planet where you see that kind of HIV rates, and yet among Black people in Los Angeles County, we have an HIV positive rate on 8th and Bonnie Bray, a stone's throw from LA Live, walking distance from the AIDS office, of 8%. The epidemic is not over. We live in perilous times. There are points in time that test who you are. Many of us said that we are going to be in this fight until it's over. Let me assure you that it is not over. What we do now speaks volumes about who we are, both in what we do and what we don't do. There are no innocent bystanders in this battle. You either are part of the fight to truly end the AIDS epidemic, or you are complicit in the devastation that is still being wreaked on our community. I have a reoccurring dream, and in my dream, there's a little boy who asks a wise old woman, "What did you do during the plague years? What did you do when thousands and thousands and thousands of people were dying?" I always wake up before the woman has a chance to answer. I'm afraid I wake up because I'm afraid of the answer. I'm afraid the answer will be not enough. And while we've not fulfilled Ken's challenge of ending the AIDS epidemic yet, I believe we will. We certainly have the tools. No, we have the diagnostic tools. We have the surveillance tools. We have the treatment tools. We have the prevention tools. No, but the question is, will we use those tools universally, expeditiously, and humanely? Let's not get it twisted. Being able to end the AIDS epidemic, the fact that some of us are still alive, does not mean that it's mission complete, and we can't rest until it is. The day will come when this epidemic will be over, and when it does, it's important for them to know we were not all monsters, that we were not all cowards, that some of us dared to care in the face of it, some of us dared to fight because of it, some of us dared to love in spite of it, and it is in the caring and the fighting and the loving that we live forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to open up to, I want to invite you all back up to the stage. We're going to have a brief discussion with the panelists and the speakers, and then we're going to open it up to you all for questions.
We'll share mics. Oh, you have mics too. They have mics.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all again for sharing your stories and being a part of this evening. I think it's our hope that this is the first type of community discussion and share, that this will continue to be a part of what it means to have an AIDS monument in the city of West Hollywood. To that point, I would like to start by asking you, Mayor Duran, what's your highest hope for having a monument here, and why do you think it's important now to have a monument?
Thank you, Rocco, and thank you to everybody who spoke. I'm over here, crying and laughing and doing what we do when we all get together. And thank you, Phil, for where you ended, because it's a perfect spot. When we first started talking about this, we had to consider the possibility that AIDS was going to be with us for 100 years. It's not something that I wanted to think about, to think that those of us that saw the beginning, it was possible we wouldn't see the end. And at the same time, we realized that so many of our people were passing away just of old age. And that if we didn't start to gather the stories while simultaneously continuing the fight, that we would lose an opportunity. So John D'Amico is my colleague. He's still here in the back. When we first came up with putting this together for the city, we demanded it have three legs to the stool. One, that we remember the dead. Two, that we recognize the heroism of the women and men who responded. And three, that we continue to educate on HIV, because it's not over. That we had to do all three because we had to consider the possibility that it was going to be around for a very long time. And my dream is that 3-inch headline, AIDS over, the top of the New York Times and the LA Times. That's my dream. I'd like to have it. I'm 58. Might happen in my lifetime, might not. But in the meantime, we've got to start to gather the stories. So I know that when I have a chance to speak about the monument with FAM, I always find the youngest person in the crowd, usually somebody who doesn't know what a telephone booth is, who's maybe 23 or 24 years old, and I will ask the young person, do you know what ACT UP is? Every time, no. Do you know what Lyndon LaRouche, the initiative was in Proposition 64? Tried to quarantine HIV-positive people in camps? And the 23 or 24-year-old will laugh. That's funny. No, it really happened in 1986, in November 1986. It really happened. And it became clear to me that there was a disconnect. And part of it, and I'll finish with this, part of it was that we hadn't had the opportunity to pass the torch, the legacy torch down generation to generation, because we as a movement were sort of just getting started out of the birth of the sexual revolution, and women's equality, and LGBT, and coming out of the 60s into the 70s, and the bathhouses, thank you for touching on that, and the ERA, and all of a sudden, boom, it started in 80. And we had like 14 years of interruption where we weren't able to consider how generations passed their culture and history down. So the torch was dropped, and those of us that are still here now have to pick it up and figure out how to, okay, now let's start to create the legacy. And that's what this is about. that while we continue the fight on HIV and AIDS, that we gather as many of the stories as we can before we'll have said, so-and-so passed away, we really should have asked her about this, or should have asked him about that. That we start to do it simultaneously, that we're big enough and broad enough and have enough bandwidth now to do all that. So that's our hope with this project, is that we'll gather stories like you heard tonight, and there are thousands still out there, survivors, who have stories like this that need to be gathered, collected, put together. So whether it's 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we'll have captured the history of what happened.
And so to your point about storytelling, I'd like to open it up to anyone who feels compelled to answer. How important is it to tell the broader story and that inclusive piece that you were talking about how factioned off the LGBT community is? How do we reach all communities and encourage them to contribute their story, and how vital and crucial is that?
Well, I certainly think that is absolutely essential. You know, there's a thing, if you don't know where you've been, there's no way to know where you're going. But one of the things that you said, John, that I want to amplify is that we reacted to the Lyndon LaRouche initiative for a number of reasons, but one of the touchstones that we understood was the concentration camps that happened in this country during World War II with the Japanese. And what we need to understand is today, you know, our government is separating children from their parents and putting them in camps. You know, so history can repeat itself if you don't pay attention. Now, and if we don't understand the relationship between all of these things, there's a continuum of time and being focused on that. So understanding that, earlier we were talking about that, that we think we fight a battle and we win and it's over, but yet, rights can be taken away. That fascism can come back. And right now, we have, in many ways, an erasure of who we are. The whole notion of the national AIDS strategy is no longer on the White House page. That there's not anything about AIDS on the White House website. That this kind of erasure is happening. And if we aren't telling the story of the battles that were won, no one will have a roadmap on how to fight those fights today.
Dan, I'm curious, why does it feel important for you to be a part of this project?
I feel very like I'm learning every day being here listening to all these speakers, so I feel it's a huge challenge to create a space that creates a legacy that continues to communicate and tells the story so it isn't repeated. I think one of the big drivers, first met John on my first trip here and heard you speak, John, and it was about basic humanity was forgotten during this time. And, the last thing we want to put into the park is a passive memorial, something that doesn't engage the community, something that absolutely activates the community to continue the discussion. And also, I'd like to see school children visiting the memorial to learn about what went on. The memorial's designed to encourage people to walk through it. It's not a singular object that that the viewer can remain passive. They need to be actively involved, walking across the site, discovering what's there, engaging with the process. So I also think it needs to be engaged by community groups as well at key times of the year, at the National AIDS Day, during the Pride Festival. The worst thing we can do is build this object and have it sit there on its own. The exciting thing is it's part of an amazing community parkland, that there will be people constantly visiting the site, and we just need to think about how we program it into the future to make it effective.
For each of you, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'm curious if you had one word to describe what you want people to feel when they're at the monument, what would it be?
Well, for me, it would have to be hope.
I was going to say strength.
Moved.
Anger.
Empowered.
If tonight's moment of reflections from each of you is any indication of what would be felt, I felt all of that and more. So I feel confident that this space will hold all of that. We're going to open it up to the audience if you all have questions for any of the panelists or.
Any
I
questions?
have a question, actually.
I love the journalist.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've been sitting on it, but it's like, okay, that time was done. But I mean, one of the things is that because we all did share, we opened up and we shared our stories. But what we're seeing, to follow up on what Phil was saying, what we're seeing is like, people seem to be inured. We're only now getting people stirred up by seeing, images of children being stripped away and crying as their mothers are being patted down by ICE officers. If we have a society that is like slow to react to that, how the hell are y'all gonna, turn a monument into something that empowers and inspires activism? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, I have a historical moving story, and isn't that interesting? And that's our legacy, but, kind of yawn. Okay, that was then, this is now. We're seeing people, we're seeing voting rights taken away. I remember, we were talking earlier, I remember with Prop 8, the kids said, you can't take marriage equality away. We have marriage. They took it away. That was a constitutional right. So how are you going, since you're the artist, how are you going to inspire activism?
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, a very challenging thing to do. So, I am the artist and designer for the project. There's FAM also who are involved in the monument experience. There's we met with part of the team today that's looking after the online and digital experience, and that's a very strong part of making the monument successful. I think we talked about the possibility of maybe a curator of the monument, so that there's an ongoing program and community outreach to embed it in the community. I think there's a great opportunity. As an outsider, I'm an Australian. I wasn't here during the AIDS epidemic, but we looked to America for the solution, and a lot of the world did. And that's a strong part of the story too, and legacy of the epidemic. I think the monument can't just be built and left. It needs to be nurtured if it's going to be effective. And so I think we need to put those things in place.
And so here's a quick story. World AIDS Day, December the 1st. We had about 100 people gather for a candlelight vigil, like we do in West Hollywood every year. Crescent Heights and Santa Monica Boulevard, where Rob Roberts set up Queer Village, right? All these people from that time. And we were getting ready to head out. They had quilts. It's World AIDS Day, and the sheriff showed up. And there were some Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence there who were in their 20s. It occurred to me that these were not the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence that I knew from the 80s, who would now be in their 60s, right? Very young sisters. And the sheriff deputies that were there were also in their 20s and 30s. And they had prearranged for us to walk on the sidewalk. And so I gathered the sisters. I said, we don't walk on the sidewalks for World AIDS Day. We walk on the streets. And they said, oh no, the sheriff's told us we have to. I said, I know what the sheriff's told you. I know what the sheriff's told you. We are going to walk on the streets. And they looked at me and I said, yeah, we may get yelled at, we may, I doubt, get arrested. I'm still the mayor. We're not going to get arrested. You know, we are going to walk on the streets. And everybody looked and kind of looked. And it was a teachable moment. And then they gathered the front quilt and they moved out into the streets. And the sheriffs kind of panicked. And I said, we're walking on the streets. And we walked the streets. What was important there was just to remind our young people, this is our culture. This is who we are. This is how we LGBT people operate and our allies. Whether or not it'll move them into ultimate action, like any movement, that's going to be an individual choice, right? Until it happened. Every great civil rights movements, you know, the sit-ins at the lunch counters, it took forever until the attack dogs with Bull Connor finally woke up middle America to do something. Kids are now being snatched from their parents. A lot of us are starting to rage about it. Eventually there'll come a time when people will snap. All we can do really is set the stage, right? We set the stage, we set the values, we set the beliefs. If the monument accomplishes that, just to remind our people, this is who you are, you come from good stock. We do not walk on the sidewalks on World AIDS Day. Every other, it's like, you know, the Jewish, you know, the Seder, you know. Why is this night unlike any other night? On World AIDS Day, we walk on the streets. Just, that's who we are. That's what we do. And if we can do that through art, just to remind people about that, I'm going to have to trust that young people will know what to do next.
I think that intergenerational piece is really the key thing that you're getting to, of like that connective tissue within our community, of passing those stories down and having that space to gather. And that what you're saying about programming, that feels vital and crucial to keep it as a living space. Because as you said, and as we all in this room know, this fight isn't over. And I think young people can seem complacent, but I also think this digital piece will speak to them in a different way too, because you give them a 1.5 minute video like we watched, and that's engaging in a whole other way. I think seeing and feeling that emotion and just a clip of your story is so impactful, and it brings it to life. And it's not just reading it, it's not seeing a date, it's not having an obscure fact, it's having a face and a story attached to something that we didn't experience.
Rocco, there's actually a young person right behind you with a question.
I'm gonna go here first and then there, sorry.
Greetings, I am youth pastor and community organizer Jace Dawson. And my question to all of you is, as future leaders here, how are we able to engrave those historical stories in the minds of those in my generation and those after me? And how are you guys able to assist us in doing that?
Go ahead, you first.
Well, I think that what's really important is to not think of these stories as historical artifacts. You know, to look at them and to think about them as mechanisms to engage and to interpret and to apply to what you're doing now. The truth of the matter is that ACT UP, you know, learned many of its lessons, you know, from the Black Civil Rights Movement, and the Black Civil Rights Movement actually learned its lessons from Gandhi. And so you know, as Dr. King talked about the arc of justice, there are lessons associated with the arc of justice. And I think that the role that, you know, those of us who are older can play is to, number one, try as best we can to communicate what that process was like, to speak the truth, that we were, quite frankly, in many cases no older, in some cases younger, than many of you are now. And so it is sometimes frustrating to me when older people then pretend that younger people can't lead. I was 23 when I led my first march, and so I think that the two ways is to share the lessons, acknowledge that many of us were young when we started doing this work, and 3, to move out of the way.
I have a response as well. I'm the news editor for a publication called the Los Angeles Blade, and we have an op-ed section, which is an opinion section, and I continually look for new voices to share for the larger community, if you will, so that we're both online and in print. And I think that, right now voices are shared on social media through Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, a lot through Facebook. But sometimes we don't exactly know what the hell is happening with Facebook and can't necessarily trust what is on Facebook. I can offer a little bit more credibility. So if you'd like to talk to me afterwards, maybe that's a way just to start sharing your stories and see yourself in context with other people. I mean, I've interviewed, I haven't interviewed Stephen for a while, but, these guys I know pretty well, and I just had a piece up on Rashad Robinson from Color of Change, and I've asked David Jones of National Black Justice Coalition to write a piece on Juneteenth. So, I'm reaching out to a lot of people, and a lot of people are showing up, and I'd be happy if you want to show up too. We need to have that kind of exchange so people get to know you, and you get to know a whole slew of other people too. That would be my suggestion.
Hello, my name is Thomas Davis. I'm a program coordinator with Black AIDS Institute and also am the creator of the Catharsis Project. So I guess two things. I just want to thank you all for first being up here and sharing your stories as a young person and millennial. I'm 26 years old, and just hearing all these stories just is really, really impactful to me. And it's just I just want you to know the importance of it, and as a young person, I see that. And just to not underestimate the power of these stories. I've worked with other young people before, and I've brought the information that was given to me about ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and when you are able to share these stories and talk about, and not just have it be, just a date and, a picture or something, and you're able to talk about, the stories of, marching on the White House and throwing your lover's bones over the fence, with the ashes, and talking about how important and how impactful that was. Young people do respond to that, and I also give respect that sometimes retelling those and going back to that place can be traumatic. So to kind of speak to the intergenerational part of this, I feel that our community is very severed and very damaged when it comes to the different generations. I think one of the things I hear the most, or I heard the most, people stopped saying it to me, usually because it was a big argument after, would be that you don't understand what it was like to lose all these people, and it's like, no, I don't. I don't understand that, and I won't be able to fully understand that. So how do you think we as two different generations can bridge that gap in, one, bringing the empathy to those of us that, didn't experience that, and also vice versa, bringing the understanding that, we won't understand that, and that's not something to be held against us, it's something to be built upon. There was a question in there somewhere.
I have two thoughts. One is, it seems to me that one of the goals of the marches was so that you wouldn't have to understand that. I mean, that was the whole point. And two, you don't have to understand my experience to have empathy to understand your experience. While the kinds of injustices that we experience and the kinds of tragedies that we experienced in the 80s are not the same kind of injustices and tragedies that are manifesting themselves today. But don't get it twisted, that there are injustices and tragedies that are manifesting themselves today. So you don't need to have a firsthand understanding of my experience. What you do need to do is to be in tune with the injustices and the tragedies that are happening every day today, and understand your obligation to respond to them.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think one of the other points he makes is very important, which is that, sometimes we crack on kids who don't understand what the hell we're talking about, and that's not fair. And so, I take his point that we have to sort of step back and give them some space and room and not patronize in terms of, I'm going to teach you, but rather, bring people along and at the same time understand. I've gotten a lot of lessons. I've learned a lot from, young people who tell me I don't understand what the hell they're talking about. So it's up to me to sit down and understand them too, which is not to, put your piece in a box, because I understand that, but I do want to support what he's saying about how we have an obligation to listen to, I think.
I feel like this is one point where I would like to inject the importance of the arts, not just the monument art and the archive art, but John and I both sing with the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles for many years. He is the chairman of the board, and we both sing and sing for our lives, and it is an intergenerational experience. And I know of no other place where we have such communication between the generations, among the generations, as we do in the chorus, and I'm sure in other choruses around the country and around the world, and in drama. And one of the things that Natsu reminded me was that I said something about how AIDS should be a musical, and in some ways that might be able to convey things that the political activism can't quite get across to the newer generation, the younger generations. But the power of singing for our lives with each other. We did a concert, was it a year ago now, the I Rise concert at Disney Hall, where I had the opportunity to tell a 3-minute version of my story in the midst of all of this music, talking about the LGBT experience of faith. And as I told my story about surviving AIDS in the 80s and all that happened, I had all kinds of young members of the chorus and young members of the audience come to me in tears saying, I never really got it until now. And it was the combination of the storytelling and the singing, the music that conveyed the power, building bridges we talk about in the chorus all the time. And we build bridges amongst ourselves that way and hopefully bring it to other people as well.
Just wanted to briefly respond to your comment. And by the way, everything everyone's saying here is so great. I did a radio interview this morning, KPFK, for LGBT Latinos and Latinas, because I guess for better or worse, I was the first LGBT Latino elected on the West Coast, way back in 2001. And what I wanted to talk about, and what I did talk about, was it's like the game The Wheel of Fortune. The really harsh fascist politics, they spin the wheel. And whose turn is it to be the other? The other, sometimes it lands on African American, sometimes it lands on LGBT, sometimes it lands on Jew, sometimes it lands on Muslim. Those who hate pretty much hate across the board. And as the point I made with the Latino audience this morning, but I want to make with LGBT people as well, is because we have been in the shoes of the other, and we know what that marginalization feels like, it will have been wasted. Our experience will have been wasted if we're not willing to fight for the Muslim who's being targeted. You talking about immigrant kids, you know, that's my Latino community's issue right now. Hearing you say it gives me hope, like, yeah, it doesn't always have to be Latino voices saying this is wrong. It should be LGBT voices saying we've been in that place and we will fight to make sure those kids get back with their parents. And when the wheel spins again, whoever it lands on next, we all lock arms and remind America what America is supposed to mean.
There's the young lady behind you.
Behind you.
Good evening. First of all, I want to thank all of you, those four amazing people who have done so much and have been in my life for the last 30-odd years. And I remember them well. And Karen reminded me, you know, I came here in 1980, you know, as an actor from London. And so my first family was my family, my gay and lesbian family, called gay and lesbian family at that time. Those were the people I loved. So obviously, when around 1984 and AIDS was happening, what else was there to do? Those were my family, the people I loved. So I had to be with them. And I remember those early days at Cedar Sinai and going to see my friend Steve, who was in the hospital. And at that time, as you say, they had yellow tape around the rooms. Isolation, you were not allowed in. And of course, I was really pissed. And the first thing I did was snap the yellow tape, push through, and I believe that I elbowed a couple of nurses in the ribs when they tried to stop me getting in. Nobody was going to stop me. So I knew that's when trouble was going to start for me. And then I got in the room and with my two friends, and was with my friend Steve, who was shivering. He was so cold. People were so cold when they were sick. And of course, I climbed in bed with him to keep him warm. And in walked two nurses. And they said, "You must get out of there." And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "It's isolation." I said, "Okay, you want to get me out? You wheel the bed out with me, or else." Suffice it to say, they never bothered me again. And that's when it started. That's when the passion started. And it's all for us. It was not motivated on idealism for me. It was motivated on love. When you love, nothing stops you. Nothing stops you for doing what you want to do. And I think that's what motivated so much of us. We were fiercely in love with the people we cared about, and nobody was going to ever stop us. And I think that's the big difference. And that's when we were there for each other. I don't know if you remember the hayride that we started around 1984-85, when Louis Stay next door started that support group for people with AIDS. And she was magnificent. And about every week, 300 people with AIDS would gather over at the hall next door with the friends that loved and supported them. That was the famous hayride. And there was so much love there. And we were there for each other. And it's also there that I started hearing friends saying, you know, "I'm sick and what's going to happen to my animals?" And they were scared because there was nothing else left for them. And that's when I spoke to my friend Steve one day when they tried to take the cats away from someone I loved, and he said, "We need to do something." Got to the hayride, spoke to those people, and said, "We are going to start something. We are going to start Pause." We didn't know. And there we were in a tiny closet. Everyone told us we were insane. except our friends around us. And that's when those people rallied around. People like my friend Karen Oakham, like my friend Phil, like my friend John. It's amazing how people rally around you. And we started PHILL, which was our idea, is and was and still is 30 years later, to keep people who are living with AIDS and HIV and their pets together. Because at that time, remember, everything was gone. The friends were gone. The health was gone. The money was gone. The job was gone. But often, all they had left was that best little friend who loved them. As one of my friends with AIDS, my cat loves me no matter what I look like. And that's what ignited my passion, the passion of my friend Stan Owens, who started it with me, and the amazing people here who allowed it to happen. And that's how PHILL happened. And there are many stories about that, but I'll always remember, same place in Cedars-Sinai. Well, 4 or 5 years later, after a few more poked ribs and so on, they knew me. And some of my friends were there in the hospital dying, and they wanted to see their cat or their dog again. And especially they wanted to see the dog. And dogs and cats were not allowed in the hospital, and I'll always remember, okay, we'll take care of that. And I still carry a large bag on my shoulder. And so I would go in the hospital, they were used, I carried a long bag, big bag, and sneak into the room and open the bag, and out would pop the dog. And I was so proud of myself because I thought that nobody knew that I was walking into the hospital with a dog, and the nurses didn't know, of course. And I found out about a year or so later that they knew, because out of the bag there would be a tail wagging.
Nadia?
So I want to thank you all. So those are the people who are there, and this is why I'm so proud of the AIDS Monument, because it's so alive now. And what we did then is the past, but now we are living our present. And that is why we need you, because we don't live on our past, we live on our present and our future, and I thank you.
Nadia, thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
Very quick.
God, my question better be really good at this point. It's such an honor to listen to your stories and to hold space with you guys, so I really appreciate your time and for being here. I'm a clinical social worker and have worked in the community for a while, starting at Callan Lord Community Health Center in New York and at the LGBT Center here. And I think that I'm very much struck by the amount of trauma that I hear. And I've kind of focused my work on the experience of cumulative trauma in the LGBT community. And I'm just wondering how, if it will, how will the memorial include the idea of healing through mental health care? And what would you guys like to see around what would be most healing for the residual trauma that you've all experienced and that we heard about today?
The monument is open for programming, and I hope that when the ribbon is cut, that you will bring your ideas and programming to that place. It is just a venue. John D'Amico insisted that it be constructed in such a way that it was a way for somebody to speak and people to listen. That work that you're describing has to be done, and the monument is open. The current fan board, they're about constructing it, I think. We'll see how many of them survive into what's going to happen the day after the ribbon's cut. Some of them may continue, some of them may say, done, 8 years, done. But once it's open, then the next phase begins, and I think your idea, your suggestion is badly needed. We have walking wounded, thousands of walking wounded.
And, you know, speaking of the intergenerational thing, you have this big, huge Anita Mae Robinson thing opening up that's got both young people and older people in it. You can start testing out programming there to have not only intergenerational, because younger people are going to have trauma of living on the streets, being kicked out. You know, older people, I'm safe now, but if I, you know, get kicked out or whatever, I have to go back in the closet if I want to get into some health facility. So there's a lot of healing that you can work on there, and then take those groups to the monument and then come back and have some, it's a pilot project, but you can start figuring that out with Lori Jean now.
So, are any other final comments here on that? I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah, we have to be out of the
Yeah.
space. But I do, but I do encourage all of you. I mean, the point of this is that this conversation could continue on, ideally forever, right? And it's our hope that anyone who has stories they want to share, such as this woman, like, take those stories and contribute to this archive, because they'll live on there, and they'll also inform Dan's thinking about the creation of this space. So again, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time and the energy to share your stories like this. And thank you all for coming and being a part of it as well.
And thank you, Rocco, for being such a great moderator. Thank you, Rocco.
Well, I think you guys were recording it.